Hi there everybody, we're going to be doing a video all about how to use these wonderful pedals into using pedals with bias effects, with THU Overloud, which I'll be using with any sort of amp modeling software. So this is what I'm going to be using. Let's start with the tippy top here. This is the very first pedal that I'm going to be going into. It's Earthquaker Devices Palisades. It basically does everything that a tube screamer can do. I'm going to have it set as such, as you can see here. It's just a tube screamer with three different modes. And then I'm going to have the chuck pedal Zen-like. I also have a Zendrive that I like to use, but I have this on my board right now, just temporarily. This is kind of my stage 2 overdrive. Then we have the Friedman BE-OD, which don't think this means it's an overdrive. It's definitely anything but. It transforms the whole entire amp, can give you just a completely different tone, and it's a very versatile pedal. Here is the Boss DD20. It's a very simple, straightforward pedal. I'm going to be using the tape setting pretty much the whole time. This is a Mercury7, the Maris, just for reverb. Okay, that's all I'm going to use it for. And then here is the secret preamp. This is to replicate an Echoplex preamp. Just to get that different kind of sound, I like to think of it like a 70s type of rock sound, classic rock sound. A lot of different players kind of have this sort of sound in their playing. Eric Johnson, Philip Sace more recently. Just overall really amazing pedal. But as you can see here, we have a lot that we can play with. So let's see what we can do with that. Alright, so I've got my pedal board hooked up and I am going from the guitar into the Palisades, and then the very last pedal, the secret preamp, is going into my interface. I do have a DI box that I'm using just as like an extension cord. Just that way it's easier to keep everything routed here. Otherwise I would just have the quarter inch going straight into here. So it doesn't really matter how you do it, but this is the general setup. Let's talk about how I have the amp set on the software. I think that's the most important thing because that's going to dictate what you can do with your pedals. The very first thing, if we look on the screen here, is I do have a Marshall style amp. I really like that Marshall style of tone. So whenever I think of pedal platform, I kind of think of that style of amp, whether it's like a kind of on the brink of crunching plexi, that kind of really full sort of tone. And here's what that sounds like. And you can hear on the bridge pickup that it's already crunching a little bit, but if I go to the neck, it's actually pretty clean. So let's look at the settings that I do have here. I am using THU Overloud. I really like the sound of this software. It just sounds awesome right out of the gate. Ignore this chorus phaser pedal. I'm not even using it. But you can see here I'm using the Brunetti. And this is an Italian amp maker. And this is an Italian software, so it kind of makes sense that they would have some Italian amps in there. They also have some DV Mark amps and all this other stuff. So the first thing you want to decide is what style of tone do you want to go for? For example, if I wanted an Eric Johnson style tone, I would probably put in a plexi, and we'll get into that a little bit because different amps are going to react in different ways, and depending on how you set them in the software, that's really what's going to give you that overall tone. I'm using actually channel 2 of the amplifier. So as you can see here on the right side, I see Brunetti Mercury EL34 channel 1, and they also have a channel 2. I tried channel 1, it didn't sound as good. It sounded way too clean, way too sterile, and I really hate the sound of clean guitar mixed with dirty guitar. Some people really like that, maybe for blues or whatever. I don't like that at all, so I try to avoid that as much as possible. So what I did here instead is I went for channel 2, lowered the gain, and basically just cranked the volume. And it still wasn't loud enough because this knob over here, the more volume knob, I actually had to turn it up quite a bit. It's about 5.5 dB up, just so that way I can have a good clean sort of signal going through. Stage 2 is what I did here. I decide to split the signal. I do this all the time, whether it's in real life applications or digital applications. I like to have kind of a stereo signal going on. It just gives you a much fuller, tighter sound, or it could be looser if you want. It just depends on what you decide to use. I'm using the Brunetti 4x12 cabinet, and you can see right here it's a 4x12 Brunetti Custom, and it has this microphone right in dead center. Nothing has been changed. It's a 414 mic and everything. And then I have on the right side, panned a little bit to the right, is this, which is a vintage 30 equipped orange 2x12 cabinet. Everything is going to sound different about this. I added in a little bit of rear mic. I also added a different microphone. I'm using the SM57 style microphones. So I don't do hard pan left, hard pan right. I actually do a little bit left, a little bit right, and then I kind of decide which kind of way I want to go more towards. I like the sound of that left cab a little bit more, that fuller 2x12 or 4x12. So I'm going to move that slider towards the number 1, and that gives me a little bit more of this 4x12 sound. And then at the very end, reverb doesn't really work as well if you're going direct into your interface. I don't know why. Maybe it's just because there's way too much harmonic information, too much content going on, that a simple 1/4 inch can't really contain it all, because it sounds very, it just doesn't work as well. So what I'm using here instead is a plate reverb. And you can use one in your software, in your DAW, whatever, but try using a reverb digitally. So that's what I'm using here in the settings, in case you are interested. Ignore the delay. I'm not really using that. I just put it in there thinking I was going to use it, but I didn't. So here's the sound without the plate reverb. Here's the sound with the plate reverb. And it's decently wet. It doesn't have to be overly wet. But I can adjust that here really quickly. I can bring that down just a touch. And that's good enough for me. Going into my drive pedals, how do I like to set my drive pedals and how do I like to use it with digital software? Well, it's very similar, at least with this application, using it just like an actual amp. So I like to always find kind of the unity gain level. So that would be your volume knob on your pedals. I try to set that right at about the same volume or a little bit higher, just a little touch. So here is the Palisades gain A. Gain A is set more of like a traditional Tube Screamer lower gain sort of setting, whereas gain B has more of the pedal gain. So here's gain A. Here's gain B. That works just fine. So all of your drive pedals are really going to work just as if you're going through an amp. You might have to do a little bit of tweaking, but generally this is how I set my pedal if I'm going to be using it on an amp. If I like that kind of sound, like for example, I really like gain A with the boost. That reminds me of kind of like a driven plexi sound. So I might do something like... Right? Just sounds great. Sounds really full. So that works just as intended. So don't worry too much about your drive pedals. They're going to work just fine. Here's the Zendrive type pedal. I think of it as just like a really nice push. Just enough. Like it colors the sound in a very interesting way, and it works just like as if I was using it, again, in front of an amp. The Friedman BE-OD, because it is more of a distortion pedal, is going to be the one you're probably going to have to tweak the most. Any sort of distortion pedals, because of the difference in how the EQ is working, how it's really shaping the sound, you might have to alter those a bit. So the way you saw in the beginning is basically how I have it set. And it's just kind of these different sort of settings I tried, and here's what it sounds like just with that on its own. Just great. Just great. Once you find, you know, exactly where your distortion pedals sound the best, you'll eventually kind of get the hang of it and you'll be just fine. So the drive pedals, overdrive works exactly as I think is intended. The thing I am going to add is that if you have a buffer, you might intend to want to use it. And again, it just depends on the tone that you like. I found that with the Palisades, if I didn't have that buffer on, it just sounded kind of dull. And every other pedal sounded just fine, but just the Palisades, it sounded kind of like blah. It wasn't really doing much. So once I turned that buffer on, it really came alive for me. So those work just fine. After the Friedman, I do have delay, and I have it set as a tape delay. I actually really like using analog and tape delays in the front of the amp, but digital delays I like to keep in the effects loop. So I imagine this digital delay here in the software is like it being used in the effects loop. So that might be something you might want to use. I didn't really find a need for it, but it is there, right? So it is kind of interesting to... And it just sounds great. Works just like a delay. The level might have to be a little bit higher than you might be used to. On an amp, for me, that would be way too high. But in this, it sounds great, apparently. So I do have that set, just, you know, a few repeats and everything. And then here's the reverb. This is the interesting thing. If I turn the reverb off here in the software and then use the pedal, it sounds like this. And it sounds okay. I think it works just fine. You know, for whatever sort of application, maybe you like that kind of tone for your reverb. I personally don't. I like this kind of breathy, more direct to the ear kind of tone. So if I turn the plate reverb on, same exact settings of everything, and just play that same thing, I can, of course, use the reverb. So if I wanted more of that ambient sort of tone, that's what I would do. I would stack these reverbs into each other. The Mercury7 stacking with that plate reverb sounds amazing. I really do like the sound of that. But just the Mercury7 by itself, not so much. So maybe different reverb pedals might react a different way, but I found that for my applications, it didn't really work as well as I thought. Lastly, the secret preamp. It works just as it would on an actual amp, but it does do a bit more to the EQ. So normally on an actual amp, it'll actually give me this really nice, fuller sound that I really like. But in the software kind of idea here, what it does is it curves off the low end significantly, tightens that up a bit, and then gives me a kind of like a low mid push. So to illustrate that, I'll use the Palisades first, and then I'll use the Friedman. Here's the Palisades gain A with the boost that I really like. Here's that tone. Here's the secret preamp on. Really shapes the EQ in a different way. Here's the Friedman pedal on its own. Here's a Friedman pedal with delay with the secret preamp. Now to illustrate a point, you know, so if I'm using this sort of style of amplifier here, and I go to, say, this Eric Johnson platform, okay, so here's an Eric Johnson platform. The only thing I have going is this plexi sort of head set the way it is here. I'm using a 4x12 cabinet like this. You can see the settings there. And I'm also going to be using a plate reverb, but I have it off. Here's what the amp sounds like on its own. Completely different tone. You can already hear that amp is full and crunching, right? What happens if I turn on this plate reverb, which I'll do there, and then let's say I have the Echoplex on. Some delay. And then here's the Zendrive. All of a sudden I have a completely different sound, completely different way of using this. So I can use this amp as if it's already driven with my pedals, with delay, and the only real thing I'm using in the effects loop is, again, the plate reverb. And you get just an amazing sound. So of course you can use a cleaner sound, you can use a dirtier sound, just depends on what you like out of your guitar sounds. A quick recap. First of all, make sure to choose the right amp type for you. If you like the AC30 style sound, go for that. If you like Fender, use that. If you like Marshall, use that. After that, mess around with the cabinets, whether it's a mic placement, different types of cabinets, one cabinet. You could definitely do that and see what you like the best. Or you can use two of the same exact cabinets with different microphones, you know, so try and find a way to use that just to get this nice full tone. After that, you might want to put a plate reverb or some sort of reverb in the effects loop. I really like plate reverbs because they tend to be as wide open as you want, as ambient as you want, but also closed off a bit, depending on how you set everything. So it's kind of like a good general reverb sound. Besides that, the most important thing is the fundamental tone you have out of your software. If that's not sounding good, it's not going to sound good with your pedals, just like in real life.